You're listening to Wildlife Control Consultant, where we provide research-based information on all things related to vertebrate pest management. Hi everyone, Stephen Van Tassel here, Wildlife Control Consultant, bringing you another episode of my podcast, the Wildlife Control Consultant Podcast. Well, glad to have you on board. I hope your week went well. I have been quite busy. I made it through a conference and some additional travel, and back in Montana now, and hopefully things are going to be quiet for at least the month of August. Is my hope. But nevertheless, I hope wherever you are in watching that your business is doing well, and you're taking a little bit of time to learn something new that we're going to offer you here with the Wildlife Control Consultant Podcast. If you're new to the podcast, you're wondering what's this all about? Well, we provide technical, research-based information on all things related to the control of vertebrate pests. So we tend to get into the weeds a little bit, and also asking questions and digging into the research literature in ways that traditional podcasts can't do it. So there's a lot of podcasts out there that are, saying, here's how you set this trap, here's how you do this, and giving you some methodologies. We're taking it to another level in the sense that we're looking at research and things that people in the business of wildlife control just don't have the time to do. And then we're trying to extract information from that would be useful for people in the field trying to solve real world problems, but don't have the time or the energy or maybe even the interest, hopefully that's not true, to look up this literature for themselves and apply it for themselves, because, hey, we can't do it all, right? And that's why each of us have different skill sets, and that's why we need each other. But nevertheless, we're glad to have you on board. Do take a few moments, if you would, to subscribe to the channel, ring the bell so you can be notified of future podcasts. I tend to publish once a week, and of course, we are always looking for people to be guests on our podcast. And of course, before you reach out to me, please check out the podcast on being a guest on the show. That was done approximately in June. So that's going to be available. A little search shouldn't be too hard to find that. But also, but then once you've viewed that, be happy to reach out to me. I'd love to hear from you. We love having guests on our show because we think it's an important way of getting new information out to the wildlife control public. How do you reach me? Well, you can get me at wildlifecontrolconsultant@gmail.com, wildlifecontrolconsultant@gmail.com. I do have a website, of course, and so here's some of the books that I have been involved in, and so hopefully some of those would be of interest to you, and I also provide some services both in training and ghostwriting and something along those lines. If you have a question, definitely don't feel free to reach out and contact me. We'd love to hear from you. All right, well, what are we going to do this week? Well, I came across an article, and I've had it in my kitty for a while. Let me pull up my PowerPoint here. So I need to kind of get that started. And there we go. And so this is the topic, and it's basically, how do you know which trap is the most effective or attractive to the target animal that you're looking for, right? Looking to capture. And that is, not all traps have the same attractiveness or efficacy or luring ability. And so that type of research is really time consuming. And wildlife control operators often don't have the time to do that, and so they have to, rely on memory, which of course can be fungible, and people can sort of have a recency bias and this sort of thing. And so, if you're trapping, what would be the best device to use, all things considered? So there was an article published by, let me pull it up here, by Yoav Motro and others. I'm not going to read all the names there, but Yoav Motro, he's an Israeli, and I believe this was published in 2019, so fairly recently. And what they did, it's a multi-year study looking at the trapping efficacy of 11 different rodent traps. Now, these traps were used in an agricultural environment, so that's a little different than going out into the woods and trying to catch a fur bear or something. So these are animals that are typically damaging agriculture. As you may or may not know, rodents really can wreak havoc on agricultural crops, and they can be a significant pest for people involved in the production of food, for example. So they did this multi-year study. It's a massive study, and they basically compared all of these different traps. And so we're going to kind of go through some of those. And you may say, well, I don't really trap a lot of rodents. I'm not trapping in an agriculture environment, and that's okay. I'm sure most of you are not going to be trapping in an agriculture environment. But the point is that we read things outside of our discipline or our area, because sometimes we glean ideas and get a different perspective that we can then pull into our area and asking that question and applying it to our own context. For example, there's going to be some principles at the end of this presentation that you're going to want to think about for the application of controlling vertebrate pests. Typically, most of you are going to be working in a structural or urban or human impacted environments, such as suburbia, urban areas, and the like of like this. So here we have an illustration from an agricultural setting, but some of the principles, or at least some of the questions that are being asked, are very relevant, at least in my opinion, to those people who are going to do controlling vertebrates in suburbia or urban areas. All right, so bear with me. So this was published in Mammal Research. And again, it was published in 2019, and the title of the article is A Comparison of Trapping Efficacy of 11 Rodent Traps in Agriculture. So, since he's doing the research in Israel, you can see the locations where they were doing the work, and they really had a rather broad testing, I guess, of different agricultural environments. I've visited Israel several times, so I'm a little bit familiar with some of the geography there. Of course, all of Israel, that area is going to have typically what we would call a Mediterranean type climate. But there are some locations that get really quite dry, for example. Okay, so you have the northern Negev, that's down here in the south. It's marginal land, it doesn't get a whole lot of rain, and so that's, unless they're doing some irrigation, or if they're doing dry land farming, that's some rough work down there. But nevertheless, it's very dry, kind of a sandiness to the type of soil. Then if you go up to the Golan Heights, and there's some high elevations up there, not like Mount Everest elevations. Okay, we're not talking here the Rocky Mountains per se, right? But everything's relative, because the Sea of Galilee, you may not know, but the Sea of Galilee is actually below sea level. Right? So if you compare, because the Jordan River goes down the Great Rift Valley, which goes all the way down into Africa. It's a place where the Asian and I guess the African and European plates come together. So this is the elevation differences. And so you have the Golan Heights. I would think of that as areas that are going to be higher than perhaps some of the Appalachian Mountains. Okay, and then of course you have the Galilee, the lower Galilee area, and the Yitzreel, what we call the Jezreel Valley. That's the breadbasket of Israel. Very fertile soil there, fairly well watered. And then you come down to the plain of Sharon, and that's been drained. It used to have some swampiness there. That's been drained out. It's a very big citrus type growing area. And then the Shephelah. The Shephelah is an intermediary area, so it's not as mountainous as the area around Jerusalem. And Jerusalem is this little part that's sort of this little isthmus that sticks out here into what people call the West Bank. So this is where Jerusalem is, and so that's kind of a mountainous area. The Shephelah is where the mountains begin to open up, and you start getting some broader valleys. And then when you get out to the area of Sharon, it's just coastal plain there. So you have quite a variety of habitats here and also different crops within this. Now, take a look at the scale. It says 50 kilometers. Understand that Israel is a very small area with a lot of geographical differences just within the short area. So from the area what we would call Dan to Beersheba, you're looking at probably 150 miles. And Israel, probably at the widest point, is probably 50 miles wide. So we're really not dealing with a huge amount of space here. Some people call it, the size of New Jersey. Some people say it's the size of Vermont. So it is a very compact location, but the geography can be quite different just in a few miles, which is sort of different than other parts of the United States, for example, for those of you that are more familiar with the United States geography. Well, what were they based? These are some of the habitats and crops that they were working with. Again, this is an agricultural study, so they're looking in crops that were growing alfalfa, avocados, cereals. It's things like wheat and oats, citrus, dates, deciduous trees, legumes, olives, potato, vegetables, and then of course others. So they had a variety of different types of crops within which they were doing their particular study. You can see the number of sets that they're putting out here: 67, 56, 55, 36. You may say, well, it doesn't sound like a whole lot. Well, understand that they are doing this type of trapping in a grid-like pattern. We'll talk a little bit more about that. So what were some of the traps that they were checking out? Well, again, as the title of the article says, they were looking at 11 different traps. Now, what types of animals were they looking for? Rodents. We're talking about animals the size of a mouse, a house mouse, and up to probably what we would call a small Norway rat. Okay, something like, those of you familiar perhaps with the kangaroo rat, that size of an animal, and I'll show you a picture of one of the animals that they were looking for. But all of you should be familiar with what a house mouse looks like. So the other primary target animal was something a little bit larger than that, like gerbil-ish types. So nothing larger, I would think, than a hamster in that regard. And so what were the kinds of traps that they were looking at? Well, the box trap, a cage trap. Box trap typically has solid walls. Cage trap, of course, has wire walls. A Longworth trap, a Sherman trap. Sherman traps, again, have solid walls all the way across. They're commonly used in research. A trapeze trap, a trip trap, an Uglin Special number 2, another type of scientific type trap, a metal snap trap, a super cat, a Victor mouse trap, and a Victor rat trap. Now, I am not familiar with all of these different types of traps, and I would suspect that you aren't either. Nevertheless, there are links there that you can then look up to see what some of those pictures look like. But nevertheless, let me kind of pull one out for you here. This is the box trap that they used. And of course, it's kind of a knockoff of a Sherman trap. It looks a little bit chintzier to me, but that's my opinion. But nevertheless, obviously it gets the job done. It's certainly not very fancy design. The Sherman trap, in my opinion, looks a little more sophisticated, but maybe that also makes it a little bit more likely to break down. But nevertheless, there's a picture of the box trap that was used. So they're using a variety of different traps here, to be sure. So let me get this going again. So 11, and this is how they would place the traps in the field. They would use what was called a 5x10 grid. What that means is they would take the field and they would divide it up so that each trap was going to be 10 meters. That's going to be about 33 feet away from all the other traps. And they just simply grid the site, drop a trap. And this is to try to remove variables. Now, for those in the wildlife control field, and I know that is not the way we typically trap. We want to, because location of the trap matters, right? So But in this study, they wanted to try to eliminate all types of human bias, I would assume. And so they would simply use the grid and just see what, if you have a large enough data set, you can then begin to see if animals like a certain trap as they do another. All the traps were baited with the same identical bait. Okay, so take a grid, put the traps in. So at each site, you would have, in effect, about 50 traps placed at each location. And they would alternate these traps both by lethal and non-lethal, lethal and non-lethal. So it's just a pure randomized process through each of this. So it's mindless, right? The researchers just have to go out and, okay, we're at 10 meters away from the previous trap, drop another trap. Well, what do we drop? Well, if we had a live trap the previous time, we're going to use a lethal trap at this one and just work our way through the field. And there you go. So what were the results? And again, this is a multi-year study. I think it took them 9 years to complete, if memory serves, but nevertheless, multi-year studies. They put some real energy into this, okay? So the total amount of captures over the entire study was 1,990 animals. Doesn't seem like a lot to me, but again, recognize that they weren't always able to put the traps in maybe the best locations. Like for a good trapper, we typically gang set, right? If we have a hot location, we're going to put multiple traps there, but that's not what they could do here. So they probably lost a lot of opportunities. So in terms of captures, what was the most common animal caught in these fields? Well, number one, by a long shot, was house mice. Okay, and they have another type of musculus species, but I'm sure it's pretty similar to a house mouse. But nevertheless, 1,697 captures were mice. That's about 85% of all of their captures were mice. Another animal, the number two animal was what's called a jerd. Now, I have never in my life heard of what a jerd is, right? So let me pull up that one. And there he is, okay? It's very, very cute. But this is an animal that damages crops in Israel, and I would suspect in other countries in the Middle East as well. But absolutely adorable. I love the way he looks, that without a doubt. So this is called a jerd, right? So like I said, it's like a gerbil, probably larger than a gerbil to be sure, certainly larger than a mouse, right? But you can learn more about that if you're interested in looking that up. And then the other animals that they caught would be shrews, followed by voles. They caught 15 rats, and then they caught 27 other animals, and these would be things like birds and other creatures. And so they did have some, what I would call some non-target captures there, right? So this is one of the challenges whenever we're using trapping is that you always run the risk of non-target. So no control technique is perfect. All right, this is something that the animal rights protest industry likes people to not know about because they just want to bash lethal traps, and everyone has to use cage traps. Now, they were checking these traps, I believe, every day. So that's not always going to occur in a situation. But the idea is non-target captures is a reality of trapping, just like non-target poisonings is a consequence of using rodenticides. We want to try to minimize those things, but they can occur. So what were the results? They did all this work finding out what trap or traps were the most attractive to capturing different rodents that damaged crops. Well, the first question they're asking is which trap style worked better? Was it a live trap, a trap that captures animals alive, or was it traps that captured animals and tended to kill them? And the answer is lethal traps win out by a little over half a percentage point. Now, that may not seem like a lot, but when you consider the amount of energy involved in trapping, 0.5% of success will add up over time, right? And so because trapping is so hard as it is right now, 0.5% can make a big difference especially over time. So lethal traps clearly won out here. Now, which trap worked best? Well, they looked at this question on the basis of what was the target animal. If you're trying to catch house mice, the Victor mouse trap, very common trap here in the United States, was number one, followed by the Sherman trap, which of course is a box trap. For Jurds, the answer was a Victor rat trap, which kind of makes sense, given that it's a larger animal. It would need a larger trap. Followed by the box trap that we pictured for you earlier. And that's basically it as far as that goes. But then they ask the next question. Did different traps work better in certain environments, such as the crop? And they found out the answer was yes. When you're trapping in cereals, typically wheat was the primary one for them, or field crops, Victor mouse traps were awesome. If you're working in orchards, however, Victor mouse traps didn't do too well. Now, can you think of a possible reason for why that would be? Now, think about how would a mouse feel inside of a field of grain versus being more exposed in an orchard, right? So it makes perfect sense to be thinking that of a house mouse would feel comfortable approaching a snap trap because the mouse already feels like he's got enough growth around him to provide some protection against predators. So an open style trap would be great, would be fine. Where in an orchard, where it's more open underneath the canopy of the trees, the box trap would likely be more effective in those types of situations. Right? So these are the types of things that you have to try to, think about. What does the habitat or the location have to play in terms of which trap is more attractive to an animal? Now look at these Sherman traps, right? The Sherman trap does much better in orchards. It does okay in cereals and field crops as well, right? So it kind of have, in terms of its variance, but nevertheless not as good as the Victor mouse trap in cereals or field crops, right? Then when we look at the box trap, a much larger device, and then the Victor rat trap, of course, all of those numbers are basically kind of in the negative range in terms of their effectiveness as compared to the Victor mouse trap or the Sherman trap. Now, there's going to be some bias here, of course, because it didn't seem like they had a whole lot of rats going on out there in the fields, right? So that may be part of the reason why the Victor rat trap and the box trap didn't do as well. Obviously, if you're going for larger animals, you have to use a larger trap. So don't overinterpret this information as saying, I'm never going to use a rat trap again. That's just simply silly, right? You have to be sure that the trap will capture the animal you're going for. But the idea being is if you have two traps, both of them will capture the animal. Now the question is, which one will the animal that you're trying to capture more likely interact with? Because if the animal ignores it, it doesn't matter how good or bad the trap is. He's not walking into it, right? So that's where this question comes out. So the bottom line here is that different styles of traps may have better efficacy or attractiveness in certain locations, certain habitats, and a lower efficacy or attractiveness to the target animal in other habitats. So you as a professional or even you as a homeowner have to ask the question, when I'm trapping, which trap style is going to work better here, and think of why. Are you using box traps? Are you using cage traps? Are you using footholds? Are you using snares? Depending on your situation, of course, always follow the law, right? But nevertheless, you have to be asking that question if you're looking to be efficient as possible, because not all devices are going to work with the same level of efficacy. Because when an animal is looking at a trap, he's looking at a foreign object. And sometimes animals become what we call square shy. They're afraid of that cage. Maybe they're like, oh, I've been captured before, I'm not going in that. But the mere fact that animals often don't like to feel enclosed, and that can be a problem with box traps, for example. Some animals are okay with exposure. Maybe if it's a wide open area, the animal's looking for cover. This is where you're trying to take your trapping and wildlife control to another level. But you have to think about what kind of device are you using, where is it being used, because sometimes the differences can be subtle, and only with good record keeping will you identify what those sites are going to be. But if you're not asking the question, you're not going to know anything. So this is coming down to that question of how good are your records, and are you when you have some downtime, are you looking back over your work and saying, do you see some patterns here that can help you be more efficient with the next job? Because as I usually like to say, if you're doing what everyone else is doing, you don't have a competitive advantage. Think about that. Well, I hope you found that useful. Of course, I'm Stephen Van Tassel. I'm the owner of Wildlife Control Consultant. The Wildlife Control Consultant podcast is all about providing technical, research-based information about all things related to the control of vertebrate pests. What's a vertebrate pest? Animals that have a spine, a backbone, and that cause conflicts with us humans. And so I'm interested. Do subscribe to the channel if you have questions, comments, yes, even criticisms. Love to hear from you. You can reach me at wildlifecontrolconsultant@gmail.com, wildlifecontrolconsultant@gmail.com. Would love to hear from you. If you're a manufacturer, producer, something that you would like to maybe perhaps get a wider audience with your particular product, would love to hear from you. I'd love to have you as a guest on our show. And no, it won't cost you anything other than your time. Do check out the video that I have on how to be a guest on my show, and then reach out to me if you're still interested. Well, that's going to be it for this week. Until next time, take care, everyone.
This is the disclaimer for Wildlife Control Consultant Podcast. Vertebrate pest control is an inherently dangerous activity involving risk of bodily injury to you, others, and/or property. Vertebrate pest control also involves legal issues, so be sure to always follow national, state, provincial, and local laws when using pesticides and/or other control methods when controlling pests. Wildlife Control Consultant, LLC, Stephen M. Van Tassel, or their affiliates are not responsible for your use of the information provided here. Always consult a qualified and appropriate professional before employing the information provided here.